Hi, and welcome back to English Lessons with Stephanie. This is Grammar Lesson 4 about phrasal verbs. So what are phrasal verbs? Well, a phrase is two or more words together. And so with phrasal verbs, one of those words is a verb followed by one or more particles, such as in, out, around, at, and over. So here are some examples of phrasal verbs. And we use these a lot in American English. And so today's lesson is super important. Let's start by seeing if we can find some of these phrasal verbs. So in this passage, there are 13 phrasal verbs. Let's read it together. Yesterday, I ran out of eggs, so I decided to go pick some up. Outside of my building, there was a homeless-looking man lying on the sidewalk. I couldn't figure out if he was sleeping or if he'd passed out. Maybe he was sick. I decided to look up the local homeless shelter. I called them up to ask if they could check on him to find out if he was okay. When a woman showed up an hour later to look in on him, the man had already moved on. She thanked me for my concern and told me to call her back if he came back. And here are the phrasal verbs in the passage. The first is run out of. If you run out of something, that means you don't have any more of it. So if you run out of eggs, that means no more eggs. The second phrasal verb is pick up. Here it says, I'm going to pick some up. That means I'm going to get something. And here, the some is the eggs. So that means I'm going to get some eggs. The next one is figure out. Figure out means you can't solve a problem or just see if something is correct. So here, I couldn't figure out if he was sleeping means I don't know if he was sleeping. Or passed out. Passed out means you have fainted. It's like you lose consciousness. You're not sleeping, but you're not awake. The next phrasal verb is look up. Look up means you try to find information about something. So look up the local homeless shelter means find information about the homeless shelter. That means you can either use the internet or a book, a phone book, to find information about this place, maybe the phone number or the address. The next phrasal verb is called them up, called up. Called up means the same as call. So call them up means called them. Check on means to look at the state or the condition of something. So if you're checking on a man, that means you're looking at him to see if he is all right. And find out is the next phrasal verb. Find out means you are trying to see, trying to discover if he is okay. The next phrasal verb is showed up. Showed up means to appear. Next is look in on. Is kind of similar to check on, but it's only for people and just to see if they're doing okay. But check on is something that you can do with all different kinds of things. The next phrasal verb is moved on. In this case, moved on means moved away. The man is gone. So he moved on, that means he left. The next phrasal verb is call back. Call back means to return a phone call or to call again. So I already called her once, so I can call her back if I see the man again. And then the last phrasal verb is came back, which means returned. So you can see that it's very easy to put a lot of phrasal verbs in a very short passage. So we talked about what these phrasal verb means, and sometimes the meaning is obvious. It's clear, like call up means just to call. And look in on kind of makes sense. It means you're looking at someone, and move on or call back. But sometimes the meaning is hard to understand just by looking at the words. Like run out of. Nobody's running. Or pass out. There's no out and there's really no passing. So sometimes it can be really hard to understand what phrasal verbs mean. Okay. Understanding the meanings of these phrasal verbs is one task. And the other task is even more tricky. Tricky means difficult. And that's that you have to remember that there are 3 different types of phrasal verbs. If you can remember our last grammar lesson on transitive and intransitive verbs, you would remember that transitive verbs have objects and intransitive verbs do not have objects. So that's 2 types of verbs. Then, in the transitive category, the transitive types of phrasal verbs, there are 2 more types. There are separable and inseparable. And what does this mean? The different types of phrasal verbs have different rules about object pronouns. Right, so objects are the things that receive the actions. So if you have verbs that are separable, that means the two different parts of the phrasal verb separate. So in this first example, call up, we say I called her up. We put the her, the object pronoun, in between the two parts of the phrasal verb pick up, which separates them. We cannot say I called up her. Same with call back. We would say he called me back. Me has to separate the call and back, but we cannot say he called back me. These separable verbs can separate for regular nouns, but they don't have to. So a regular noun would be like the problem or my cousins. Here we would say I figured the problem out. And we could also say we figured out the problem. That means we solved the problem. Or my cousins, we could say I picked my cousins up or I picked up my cousins. Both would be correct. Then we have inseparable transitive verbs. So these verbs, phrasal verbs, don't separate even if they use object pronouns. So for example, look in on, these three words are not going to separate at all. So we say we looked in on my aunt or we looked in on her. And we can't say we looked in my aunt on or we looked her in on. These words will always go together. That's a lot, but let's just try and practice this to see how it works. We have on the right our chart of our verb types, so you don't have to remember, you just have to look over there. And on the left, we have several sentences that use phrasal verbs. And let's try and see how we can finish these sentences correctly. So in the first example, it says, my brother lost his job, so I should call blank to talk. Okay, so you look at our list and we find call. Do we want to say call up or call back? Well, call back means after they called you, you return their phone call or you call them a second time. But here, this is the first time you're calling, so we should use call up. So we want to say call up. However, this is a transitive verb, so we need to use an object. So here, who are we calling? We're calling my brother. My brother is a him, so we should say call him up. And the reason we want to say call him up is because this is a separable transitive verb. And since him is a pronoun, we have to put it before the up. Now that I've talked about the first one, let's take a minute and you can go through numbers 2 through 7 by yourself and see if you can get the correct answers. So pause the video, see if you can work out the correct answers here, and then unpause the video and we'll talk about the answers. So here are the answers. In the second one, my friend is late. I hope she shows up soon. So show up in the last column is intransitive. That means there are no objects. So we don't say her or it. Number 3, Susan's not here. When is she coming back? So come back in the last column is also intransitive, so we don't need an object pronoun. And number 4, what time does the store open? Let's look it up. Right, so look up is a transitive separable verb. So we need to put the object pronoun in between look and up. And here it refers to the time. So we could also say, let's look up the time. Let's look the time up. But we cannot say, let's look up it. In number 5, he didn't answer his phone, so I'll call him back later. So again, call back is a transitive phrasal verb, and we must separate it with the him. Number 6, she said she has something important to tell me. I can't wait to find out. So find out is an intransitive phrasal verb in the last column. So no object pronoun. And then number 7, I'm baking a cake. I'm going to check on it to see if it is ready. And check on is a transitive phrasal verb. We need to use a pronoun or an object. And because it's inseparable, we can use it and we can put it after the on. Okay, so that's a lot to think about. And you might be wondering, well, how can you tell the difference if you don't have this handy chart, this useful chart to look at? And I'm sorry to tell you that you just have to remember. You can also use the dictionary again and look up to see how these verbs are used. Also, there are a lot of phrasal verbs. I said 1 million, Maybe it's not quite a million, but it could seem like a million. And why it could seem like a million is because a lot of the phrasal verbs have many different meanings. So for example, the phrasal verb pick up could mean you learn something, you tidy something, that means you organize it or clean it. Number 3, it could mean to give someone a ride. It could mean to move faster, to answer a call, to obtain or get, or to attract someone. And additionally, if you take the verb pick and you change up into a different particle, like pick out or pick over, those are different phrasal verbs again. So that's why we have so many different phrasal verbs. So English can be a little tricky in this regard. So to review, there are 3 types of phrasal verbs. Separable transitive verbs must be separated when they're used with a pronoun. Inseparable transitive verbs are not separated when used with an object pronoun. And intransitive verbs are not separated because there is no object, so there's nothing to separate them with. And finally, there are a lot of phrasal verbs to know and remember, and as an English teacher, I'm very sorry about that. So thanks for joining us today, and stick with the rest of the lesson because we're going to do a reading and a listening this week that will use a lot of phrasal verbs, and then we'll talk about how to write with them and speak with them in our speaking lesson this week. Great work! See you next time.